What does a beautiful future look like to you?
You can flip a negative mood on its head.
This was a talk that was all over the place, but then New York, you are all over the place.
There are experiences that you just don't get anywhere else.
Welcome, everyone, to the COVID vaccine, How It Works and What's Next, presented by the 92nd Street Y and Mount Sinai. My name is Shannon from 92Y, and it is my pleasure to introduce our speakers, Dr. Miriam Merad and Apoorva Mandavilli, who will address how our immune system responds to intruders like the COVID-19 virus and the latest on emerging strains. Apoorva Mandavilli is a reporter for the New York Times focusing on science and global health. She has won numerous awards for her writing, including the 2019 winner of the Victor Cohn Prize for Excellence in Medical Science Reporting. She is the founding editor-in-chief of Spectrum, an award-winning news site on autism science, and co-founder of Culture Dish, an organization dedicated to enhancing diversity in science journalism. She is also the founding chair of the Diversity Committee for the National Association of Science Writers. She's joined by Dr. Miriam Merad, who is an internationally acclaimed physician scientist and leader in the fields of dendritic cell and macrophage biology, with a focus on their contribution to human diseases. She is the director of the Precision Immunology Institute at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai, and director of the Mount Sinai Human Immune Monitoring Center. She leads Mount Sinai's Precision Immunology Institute and developed the Human Immune Monitoring Center, which is now playing a key role in understanding why some patients develop severe forms of COVID-19 and some do not. Apoorva, Dr. Merad, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for hosting.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. And Dr. Merad, I'm looking forward to a very interesting and informative conversation with you about the vaccines. As you know, this year has been extraordinary and extraordinarily horrific, really. Bad news after bad news. But the one shining thing during this pandemic has been these vaccines. We now have 3 that are authorized in the United States. Can you tell us what makes these vaccines so remarkable?
Yes, no, absolutely. This is really the shining light, this recent, this last year. And the vaccines are remarkable for several reasons. The first is really the extraordinary speed with which these vaccines were developed, which is really unprecedented, but we emphasize the state of science at the time that the pandemic hits the world. And maybe we can go through the timeline, as this really exemplifies how extraordinary the process that led to vaccine approval was, which is something we will be teaching to trainees for many years to come. So in January 2020, a few months after the first pneumonia was identified in Wuhan, China, our colleagues in China were able to isolate the pathogen, so the virus, sequence it, and share the sequences with the world. That same week, after the sequences were made public, different groups in academia, different laboratories, scientists in academia and in industry around the world started to use this information to make vaccine using platforms that were already developed in their laboratory. So it's important to realize that the platforms were not developed after the pandemics hit. The vaccines were already there because of all these advances that were made in science. And they were already being tested, in fact, and some vaccines were already in use in patients. So it was very easy to redeploy the same platform using the essential information provided by our Chinese colleague to develop the vaccines against COVID-19. So that is remarkable and really emphasizes the state of science we are in. The second thing that's remarkable is the extraordinary efficacy of all these vaccines to protect against hospitalization and death. Right? So we would have been very happy if any vaccine would have protected 50% of people against severe disease. And here, there is extraordinary efficacy against hospitalization and death, which is really what we care about, right? And this is not the case for many pathogens. You have to realize that's not the case still for HIV, not the case for TB. So it's extraordinary news. And this is why I'm very optimistic that life will go back to normal, hopefully quite soon. Now, the third thing that's remarkable is that innovative platforms were being approved in a field where innovation is sparse. And here I'm referring to the Pfizer and Moderna vaccine, which have been approved for use for the first time in human. And this is very exciting because this mRNA platform really provides enormous flexibility in terms of drug design. And I think we are going to see a revolution of drug development using this platform. But what's really remarkable, really, to me, is the amount of collaboration that went into making this vaccine, which really significantly contributed to the speed and success of vaccine production. The speed in which the Chinese sequenced the virus, or Chinese scientific colleague, the accuracy and the solidity of these results, the speed with which they shared the results with the larger scientific community, which really started the whole process, and really the unprecedented collaboration between academic laboratories and industry, and also the amount of international collaboration between countries. So it's important to take the measure of what happens last year, which demonstrates first that science works and that therapeutic development can go much faster if the entire community collaborates toward the same goal. But now all this effort is only relevant if we get the vaccines and if we get to vaccinate as many people as possible.
Right. And that's the big question now that we actually have the vaccines. You mentioned that the mRNA platform, even though people think of it as new, actually has been around for a long time. People have been working on it for many, many years. But not everybody knows that. And because of the quick timeline of the vaccines, and maybe because of the unfortunate name Operation Warp Speed, some people are worried about the safety of the vaccines. So are these vaccines safe?
Yeah, so it's important to talk about speed. And I agree with you, the term warp speed was not judicious, as many of the decisions that were taken by the previous administration during the pandemic. But the question of speed is an important one because I think it's one of the major causes for vaccine hesitancy based on what's being reported. So it's important to understand why it was possible to develop a vaccine so fast. So let's go through the reasons that explain the speed of development. So I want to go back to the state of knowledge of the field when the pandemic hit. But what I said, and I think you just mentioned again, Apoorva, is that these mRNA platforms were already being developed, right? We didn't develop a new platform. They were being developed and they were being used. But before I go there, I just want to understand that there are many developments that contributed to, in fact, optimizing these mRNA vaccines. For example, I like to say that because it's important in the field that my laboratory contributed to build, is that these mRNA vaccine provide the instruction to make viral protein, and they are packaged in lipids to enhance delivery into these macrophage and dendritic cells that were mentioned at the beginning of our discussion. Well, these cells are extremely potent at building the best immune response possible. This is the only job of these cells, is to build an immune response, right? So all the knowledge that was built around these cells, in fact, helped optimize this mRNA platform. But I want to go back and really emphasize that, yes, they were being tested in patients, and especially in patients with cancer. In fact, Ugur Sahin, who is the developer of the BioNTech vaccine, is a cancer immunologist, Zayan. And we have met several times to discuss the results of his mRNA vaccines in cancer patients, which were impressive. And in fact, the pandemic just provided a phenomenal opportunity to validate what the Moderna group and the BioNTech group and many of us knew already, is that these vaccines could be very potent at inducing immunity against a microbial disease, a virus, or other pathogen. Right, so we were not starting from scratch. The J&J vaccine used, in fact, a platform that had already been used and, in fact, and has obtained FDA approval. So the platform were not being built, but the scientific knowledge was there at the time, as when the pandemic emerged. But in addition to scientific knowledge, we were able to overcome 4 major bottlenecks of vaccine development. First is speed with which clinical trials are opened in any academics in any medical center or academic center. The limitation of funding, limitation in the number of volunteers that accept to participate in trial, and very importantly is the attack rate. And I'll get back and I'm going to explain these 4 points, just a little bit more. So opening a clinical trial usually takes months, because it requires coordination between different offices, a regulatory office, a contracting office, finances, and they're all dealing with many trials at the same time. Here, all these offices make the trial their priority. And this was done in a record manner. So that's very important. And I'm hoping that we will learn to do clinical trials much faster based on our COVID experience here. Now, funding. Funding is a big issue in vaccine development. And the fact that funding was available really enabled industry to speed the development process without cutting any corner. Now, any drug development needs to go through 3 big phases. Right? The first phase is where we test drug safety and determine dosage efficacy. The second phase in an open label trial where we test clinical efficacy of any drugs or a vaccine. And the third phase is these large randomized trials performed in a blinded manner which compare the vaccine or a drug against a placebo to prove beneficial effect of the tested drug. And this is what enables FDA approval, which we call a registration trial. So usually industry advances sequentially, right? So they will never scale vaccine production to be ready for a phase 2 or phase 3 before they have, the proof that the vaccine is working, right? Otherwise, they are going to spend all the money making all these vaccine doses and they will have to throw them away. So here, because the funding was not an issue, they were able to lead the different phases at the same time in parallel. And there was, however, no shortcut. Randomization was performed. All the right measurements were performed. In fact, we have all dissected all these papers because we were looking for shortcuts. Now, remember, scientists were not trusting the prior administrations. We were afraid that, there would be potentially pressures put on the FDA commissioners. And based on everything that we have read, all the steps were taken properly. Now, the third aspect of this is the number of people that volunteer to participate in trial. And here again, the number was unprecedented. In fact, I wanted to volunteer to be part of the trial. My colleagues here also wanted to volunteer, and we were told that they were not accruing anymore. By the time I collected my colleague in charge of the trial, they were not accruing anymore because, in my age category. So everyone was volunteering to participate. And then importantly is what we call the attack rate, which is the number of infections that needs to occur among clinical trial participants to identify statistical differences in terms of outcome between infected individuals that receive a vaccine and those that receive the placebo. And that attack rate, the number of infections, which we can't control, right, as scientists, was unprecedented. And because of all of this, we were able to develop a vaccine in unprecedented manner. But based on everything we have read, we don't think that any corners was cut. I think, based on these results, all the vaccines that have been approved, both in the US and in Europe, are safe.
So that's true that now we know that all of these vaccines are safe because of the trials, but also just in the United States, we now have 81 million people vaccinated. So I think we can base some of that on that also, right? That it's been safe. But despite all that, there are a lot of people who are still hesitant to take the vaccine. Some because they're communities of color who have a legitimate reason to mistrust the medical establishment. Some because of myths that vaccines harm them in some way, that vaccines cause infertility, for example. And some might be older people just mistrusting something that they don't know and have never heard of. So how do you address that kind of hesitancy?
Yeah, this is important. And the one that I heard a lot is the ability of this mRNA to change our genes, right? Our genetic code. And I think you mentioned it to me when we first discussed. So it's important to really first understand how vaccine works. And I think this is why we are doing this today. And it's important to realize that each time people hear about genetic material, which is what is being used with this mRNA platform, they mix different type of information. So the first thing I will say, when you get information about a vaccine, it's important to know the source that is providing this information, right? And we cannot become a biologist over time. Well, Apoorva, you became a real biologist, I have to say, but you've done tons of research, right? And it's difficult to really develop this level of understanding of these complex, biological processes without being an expert. So it's important to look at your source. But
I also have to tell you that of all the things I've ever written about in my life, immunology is the hardest.
I agree, because it's a dynamic system. I agree. But you're welcome to come back and can spend some time talking about immunology.
Thank you. I may have to take you up on that, because it seems like every time I learn all the concepts there's more and more.
Yeah, there's more and more. And this is why I think it's important not to really, make up, principles that are not correct because of the complexity of the system. So about, changing the genetic code, because I really want to go through this mRNA that's being provided by these mRNA vaccines are being delivered, as I've said earlier, in this lipid. And these, and they go to the cytoplasm of the cells, and they don't have the machinery to go back to the nucleus where the DNA is, right? They just don't have the machinery to do that. And even if we were to enforce, the delivery in the nucleus, they will not be able to really integrate our genome, just because they can't do that. These are very important biological principles that you learn when you are a biology student. So there is no possibility that the mRNA are going to change our genetic code. And also, these mRNA are very fragile. In fact, the big struggle has been to delay, the survival of this mRNA in our body so that they can make enough protein so that the immune system recognize the protein and mount an efficient immune response. Okay, so that's one. The second, the infertility, there is also no data that suggests that this is the case. And maybe I think, Apoorva, you wanted to talk a little bit about pregnancy, so we'll go back to that later. I want to discuss the trust of African-American community. And because there is a lack of trust that is legitimate because of very serious errors that have been made in the past. So it's important to really acknowledge that there were errors. Okay, but this is how we'll address this question, is that all these vaccine trials have really made an effort to recruit in all community. And the African community represents approximately 20% of patients accrual base in most trials. So that's a good number to look at. So we can look at these numbers now. And it seems that the vaccines are as protective of African Americans as they are of other communities. That's important. It's also important to realize that African Americans have been somehow disproportionately affected by the disease. So it's very, very important that you get the vaccine to reduce casualty in your community. But I will also say to my colleagues, this is, and to the African American community, and this is an opportunity for us to regain trust of this community. So let's make sure that we explain to the community exactly the effort that has been made to have enough representation of African-American clinical trials, that the same type of measurement were made in all members of different communities, and that we understand error in the past, and we don't want this error to be perpetuated again.
What about older people who may be hesitant for other reasons?
Well, older people, I will say, this is what I told my mother, who initially told me, no, I'm not getting this vaccine. And, you are the population at risk. You are the population at risk. So we want you to be vaccinated. If there is one factor that puts you at higher risk to develop a severe disease and to be hospitalized, is age. And I will say also to older people, and what I told my mother, is that your immune system is a little bit weak. So it's likely that you are not going to do any side effect to these vaccines. Please take it, because I want to see you again next year. It's very important that our parents listen and older people get these vaccines, because we want them to be around us for a long time.
So, as I mentioned earlier, we now have 3 vaccine candidates authorized from Pfizer, Moderna, and J&J. And the governor of Michigan has said that he doesn't want the J&J vaccine. And I think there is a lot of chatter out there that J&J vaccine is not as good as the others. Is that true? Or is one vaccine better than the other?
Yeah, okay. So that was unfortunate that, the Michigan mayor was so vocal again, and it was wrong of him to do that. So let's go through this a little bit. So there are three vaccines. Two vaccines, the Pfizer and the Moderna, use the same mRNA platform that we discussed earlier. The J&J uses a different platform, which is based on a harmless virus that is going to also give instruction to cells that's going to produce, the COVID viral protein and induce an immune response. So two different platforms. And when the first Pfizer and Moderna vaccines were in trial, we were at a different time, right, of the pandemic evolution. Remember, there was no variant at that time, and the efficacy was quite remarkable, right? J&J was right at a different time. It's very, very difficult to compare the efficacy of these three trials. Also, these three vaccines, the J&J versus the mRNA, we're making different measurements. And so I will really not try to compare these vaccines. However, there is one endpoint, what we call in science endpoint, one measurement, and one impact that we all need to look at is was the J&J vaccines able to reduce the number of hospitalization and number of deaths? And the answer is yes, with very high efficacy. The J&J is a vaccine, is a remarkable vaccine. And I will be very happy if my mother, my aunt, will be able to take it. I will have taken it. Many of my scientist colleagues, in fact, have volunteered to receive the J&J vaccine. So the J&J vaccine was able to protect against severe disease and death, and this is what matters. So I will suggest that if you are offered the chance to get the J&J vaccine, please take it. Right, please take it. The other points I will like to make is we are being vaccinated, of course, to reduce the risk of severe disease, but also to contribute to really reducing the potential for this virus to replicate, right? And so it's very important that we keep these two things in mind. First, we want to protect ourselves, and we want also to reduce the ability of this virus to find hosts, right? And if we don't realize that, and go and look at exactly the number of patients that develop symptoms with the J&J, the Pfizer versus the Moderna, this is really not the right measurement, right? Who cares if you have a little bit of a mild disease? Of course, no one wants to be sick, and I totally understand that. But really what we don't want to have is to go to the hospital or to die or to have this very severe disease that will be very invalidating. And based on these criteria, the J&J vaccine is an excellent vaccine.
It has some other advantages that people don't really seem to talk about enough. It's the one and done. You just need one dose, and also that it can be stored in refrigerators, so you don't need all the fancy deep freezers that you need for Pfizer and Moderna, right?
Absolutely. I should have said that. Indeed, the big difference is that the Pfizer and Moderna requires 2 shots, the primer and the booster, either at 3 weeks or 4 weeks apart. The J&J requires 1 shot, which indeed, it's a big advantage, and it's much easier to transport, etc. So, absolutely.
Right, and the transportation becomes important, especially when we want to reach elderly people who can't leave their homes, or these communities of color that don't have the time and ability to stand in line for hours or sit and refresh a website over and over to make an appointment. So it seems like a very big advantage, actually.
Absolutely.
I wanted to ask you also about some special groups other than the ones that have been tested already. The CDC has said that pregnant women can take the vaccine, consult with their healthcare provider, but that there's no data indicating that it's harmful. But will there be testing done in pregnant women? Will there be a vaccine for pregnant women? And will there be vaccines for kids?
Okay, so let's talk about kids for a minute, because I'm the parents of 16 and 14 years old, and we all think about the kids. And how to protect them best. So children have not been initially prioritized for the vaccine because they were not at risk for developing a severe disease, right? So the urgency, this first vaccination campaign, is to reduce the number of hospitalizations. And this is why adults were prioritized. And also this is how we do any type of drug development. We always test first in adults and then we test in kids. So at this time, Pfizer vaccine has FDA approval for 16-year-old and older, while children between 12 and 15 are being enrolled in clinical trials as we speak. The Moderna vaccine has FDA approval for 18 years old and older, while children between 12 and 17 are being enrolled in trials of the vaccine. And it's likely that COVID vaccines for children older than 12 will be authorized by late spring or early summer. It may take longer to have kids younger than 12 to be vaccinated. But there is no reason to think that kids will not respond to the vaccine, especially in this age range of 12 to 17. So I think we will see that happening soon.
So since we're on the topic of kids, though, I have one more question for you before we get to the pregnant women, which is, do we need to vaccinate kids in order to reach herd immunity?
Okay, so that's also an important question. So herd immunity, you can reach herd immunity usually when like 75% of people are vaccinated. Now in the US, so people of 18 years old and older represent 75% of the total US population. So in principle, you can say, if I vaccinate all the adults, I don't have to vaccinate the kids, right? Of course, we will not vaccinate all the adults, so you may want to vaccinate kids. So I'm not sure it is that important to vaccinate every single kids, but it is true that kids could represent a reservoir that I was discussing earlier, a host for the virus to continue to replicate if none of them are vaccinated. I mean, this is something that we need to think about when we look at first at this vaccine hesitancy. What is the percentage of adults that are being vaccinated, and how many more we need to vaccinate? Also, the herd immunity question is of course, we should all hope to achieve herd immunity, but it's also possible to go back to normal life without, reaching herd immunity. There is, we can potentially tolerate, an endemic virus without lockdown, the same way we tolerate the flu. For example, what's likely going to happen is that, we may or may not achieve herd immunity in the US, but it is also quite clear that there are parts of the world which will have insufficient immunization, and that will contribute potentially maintaining the disease or some new surge or outbreak that may happen in the US. Like it's the case, for example, for measles, which is still endemic in some regions due to insufficient immunization. So this is why it's very important to think about countries other than the US. The strategy of America first is not very good, when we think about the pandemic. But let's say if some part of the world don't get, completely vaccinated, we are at risk of not being able to achieve completely herd immunity. But between acquired immunity due to infection and also enough vaccines, it's possible that the virus will remain endemic, but we will be able to tolerate, the virus. So it will not lead to this severe disease and high number of hospitalization that we've seen last year.
And what about pregnant women?
Okay, so pregnant women, that's a difficult question, I have to say. Okay, so let's go through the data a little bit here. So there's 3 pieces of data that I'd like to talk about when we talk about safety in pregnant women. First, a lot of COVID infection did occur in pregnant mother. And in fact, we had a lot of pregnant mothers infected with COVID at Sinai. Sinai has been really the epicenter of this COVID pandemic in mid-March. And a high number of pregnant women were infected with the disease. And what we observe is that the pregnant mother were at higher risk of needing intensive care, but it doesn't look that the newborns were, in fact, harmed by the virus. Okay, so it seems that COVID infection and the immunity that was induced upon COVID infection didn't harm the kids. And then the last piece of data that we have is that in animal model, it seems that the vaccine is safe in pregnant animals. So and this is why I think the CDC is really suggesting to pregnant women to consult with their physician before taking the vaccines, but we encourage them to take the vaccine because they are at higher risk to develop severe disease.
The FDA also has an app that people who have taken the vaccine can report side effects on. I think it has a few thousand pregnant women now, and there hasn't really been a signal of any particular side effects. So that's promising as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so I think one of the questions that really seems to come up for people is, how long will this protection last? Like, when will I need to get a vaccine again?
Yeah. Okay, so we don't know how precisely how the vaccine immunity, how long the vaccine immunity lasts this day, right? Because we started to vaccinate, but in January in the US or in December. So it's a big focus of studies here at Mount Sinai Immunology Institute and many laboratories around the world who are looking at the stability of these vaccines. But based on current vaccines, I believe that immunity will last at least for the last year. Just because the antibody level and the T-cell response that we are observing are really quite high, and there is no reason why they will still not be able to protect us in a year from now. Now, there were rumors that we were going to lose protective immunity because there were reports showing that antibody levels were reducing over time, in infected patients. So I just want to do a little bit of immunology here, which is what's a normal life cycle of an immune response, right? So when you get infected or when you receive the vaccines, a few days after the vaccines, you are going to observe that if your vaccine response is quite efficient, production of a large number of antibody in your circulation, and also an expansion of what's called the T cell, which is another arm of the immune response that no one really talks about, which is very, very important. And maybe I'll get back to this later. Okay, so this is what happened, some days later. Usually it can take, it depends if it's a primer or a booster, can take 2 weeks, 1 week for a booster, a few days, after a booster sometimes. And so you had this high production of antibody and expansion of T cells. And then these antibody production and the T cell numbers have to contract or reduce. It's what we call the contraction of the immune response. And it's very, very important that this happen, because otherwise we'll not be able to accommodate all the antibody that are being made against all the pathogen, viruses, bacteria that we are exposed to. So the contraction of immune response is something we study as immunologists, and it's part of the normal immune response. So the fact that antibody were decaying is normal, right? But what we need to measure is whether upon reinfection, right, or upon a booster, let's say, that we may receive in 1 year from now, potentially because of the variant, whether we will be able to re-expand this immune response. And I can say that here there is absolutely no indication that this will not be the case.
Okay, that's all very reassuring. But it seems like there's one wild card here, and that's the thing that's been keeping me awake, and I'm sure keeping you awake, and keeping a lot of evolutionary biologists awake, which is the variants. And we were told all last year this virus doesn't mutate very fast, that we would not see any mutations of significance for quite a long time. And yet here we are with a variant in South Africa, and possibly one in Brazil with this mutation, Icahn, I think they're calling it, that makes the vaccines a little less susceptible. So how should people think about that? Should they be worried about these new variants that are coming up and how vaccines will perform against them?
Okay. So maybe we can review, the data again here. So there is 3 variants that have been described today, maybe a few more, but the one that are the most, described in the lay press and in scientific press is this UK variant, the South African variant, and the Brazilian variant. Okay, so and so how do we measure, immune response against these variants? So there is one way, which is the fast way. What you do is you take vaccinated individuals that receive, for example, the Pfizer, the Moderna, the J&J, the AstraZeneca. You take the serum of this individual, purify or isolate the antibody, and then measure the ability of this antibody to neutralize the variant. So to block the ability of which means blocking the ability of the variant to infect cells, which is usually what has been done. Because it's a fast way of measuring efficacy of the vaccine. There's another experiment that you can do also in a Petri dish, where you can measure the quality of another arm of the immune system, which are the T cells. The T cells can recognize many parts of the protein. Not only this, binding region, the spike, where binding regions to the receptor, which is what really we measure when we look at antibody. Well, no one really talks about T cells because it's very difficult to measure T cell response, and only expert labs can do it. It's very tedious, it costs a lot of money, it's very long. So no one talks about these. Yet, T cells are absolutely instrumental in controlling a viral response, right? And we somehow, really don't give enough attention to this arm. We do, immunologists, but of this additional arm of the immune system. So the real experiment or real measure that we need to look at is whether these vaccines are able to protect against the disease, right? And right now, what we can say is that the J&J vaccine, which was tested after the variant appeared and was tested both in South Africa and in Brazil, seems to be as efficient at controlling hospitalization and very severe disease against variant than against the wild type virus. So that's really, I think, very reassuring, right? So, and this is the only real thing that really matters, right? So there have been reports, and I think this is why people are worried, is that this antibody measured in the Petri dish were not able to really neutralize as much. But what matters is this combination of these two arms of the immune system. So as an immunologist who study a lot this T cell response, I think that right now there is no reason to worry about this variant. The other good news is that both Pfizer and Moderna, and likely J&J, will be able to produce boosters against the variant if we were to find that they become they are able to escape an immune response, because it's quite easy to redeploy these platforms. So I will say right now, the only thing that we should worry about is let's just get this vaccine if we are offered the chance to have it, because there are many parts of the world. I come from a part of the world, Apoorva, where the doses are extremely limited, right? So it's a big opportunity that we have here to be offered the vaccine. If we are offered the vaccine, let's take it. And based on what I'm reading, I think there's a lot of chances that the vaccine that we are receiving right now will be also protective against the variant.
And Pfizer and Moderna have already begun testing their boosters against this, the mutation and the variant, South African variant. So hopefully we'll have that handy if we need it.
Yeah.
I want to ask you a few questions that have come in from people who wrote into the 92nd Street Y and asked for them. One of them is, why are the side effects of the second shot so much worse than the first?
Okay, so the side effects are due to a strong immune response, right? So the first dose, the body recognizes that something is wrong and start to build an immune response against the intruder. Now I'm going again to give some principle of the immune response, which I teach yearly to the students. First principle is that the immune system can recognize a threat. Second principle, it responds to a threat by producing an inflammatory response. That inflammatory response is what's going to be able to eliminate the threat. Third principle, it eliminates the threat. Now, the inflammatory response is what leads to, the fevers. I have to say, I was vaccinated. I was lucky to be vaccinated, and I had fevers and chills, and I was super happy because I was thinking, my immune system is really so strong and it's really recognizing the intruder. Now, the fourth thing that it does, it also remembers the threat, right? This is the basic for vaccination. The immune system can be trained, right? So it remembers the threat. And the fourth thing is that it regulates the immune response. It's really, this is the contraction, another name for contraction of the immune response. You have this immune response, and you have to know how to dampen it. So this remembrance is what happens when we have the second shot, is that the immune system has been trained by the primer and is now capable to respond in a stronger manner. This is how you train the immune response. But don't worry, because it also knows how to regulate the immune response. And this is why the side effect of the second booster really lasts with something like 18 hours, 24 hours, or sometimes a bit longer. It goes away because the immune system knows how to really shut down that strong inflammatory response. So, but if you have side effect, it's good. It means that the immune system is very strong. Many, in fact, don't get side effect and are worried. In fact, my lab manager doesn't get side effect, and she says, well, can tell you she didn't get side effect, but has a very strong antibody response. So some are less susceptible to these big inflammatory response.
It's sort of counterintuitive, I think, for people to think that their bad symptoms mean that the vaccine is working, and it's a good thing. I wanted to ask you also about, vaccination elsewhere in the world. I mean, we keep talking about vaccination in the United States, but what happens if, all of these countries where there hasn't been a single vaccine given yet, it takes them another year to get all of the vaccines? Should we be concerned about that, or should we just think about ourselves?
No, we shouldn't, right? And we shouldn't think about ourselves, because this is a pandemic, right? Unless you decide I'm going to lock down and not travel anymore, anywhere, and not let anyone come, then maybe, you can decide to ignore it. But with the mobility that now is part of our life, and part of our work, of course we should worry. So if we want to be selfish, we should say, in order to protect ourselves and protect our job, right? And some of our industry that are dependent on this high level of travel, I need to get all the people vaccinated, as many people vaccinated as possible. And we should lobby for that. And now, in a non-selfish manner, well, you want everyone in the world to be as protected as you are against a new disease, no? I mean, it is, this pandemic, I hope, brought some humanity in us, right? So it's important that we think about other countries. There are a lot of groups, and initiatives that have been built to really deliver equitably the vaccine all around the world. I'm hoping, the 92Y community is a fantastic community of thinkers, of engaged people. So maybe you can do something about it. And we need to make sure that everyone is protected, either because we are selfish or because of the humanity within us. But it's important, yes, that we think about the need for vaccination is a global problem.
We've been hearing a lot about people talking about how they don't want to wear a mask after being vaccinated. And yet we've got Tony Fauci saying maybe we'll be wearing them even a year from now. Why is it important for people to wear a mask even after they're vaccinated?
Okay, so, a piece of data that's missing and very, very difficult to obtain is whether vaccination really protects us completely from being infected. So it protects against the disease, but it may not protect for a virus to, let's say, expand a little bit in our nose for a few days. We know that's not going to be there for a long time, but enough to, infect others. So now, out of abundance of caution, we are saying, just wear, the CDC and Fauci are saying wear the mask. What the CDC and Fauci also said recently is that if two people are vaccinated and they, two people want to meet or dinners together are vaccinated, they don't have to wear a mask, So in fact, I'm saying here in my laboratory, since all of us have been vaccinated, that maybe we can start meetings without masks, and these are the recommendations now that have come up. So I think for now we should continue and follow this measure, wear a mask in front of people that have not been vaccinated to protect them, not to protect yourself, right? And we will be expanding in terms of the number of vaccine dose, and hopefully soon we won't have to wear the mask anymore.
The last question I want to ask you is something that I think people really want to know the answer to. And I think it gets phrased in a lot of different ways. When will this end? When will life go back to normal? When can I stop wearing a mask? When can I hug my friends and neighbors and my family and grandparents? I think really what people are asking behind all of those questions is, when will we reach something like herd immunity where we can really forget that this virus even exists?
Yeah, so the answer to that is engage full force into this vaccine campaign, right? So vaccine hesitancy is what's going to delay, right, going back to normal, right? If everyone think only about themselves and not the community, right? And saying, well, I'm protected, I'm a young individual, I'm not at risk, I'm not going to be vaccinated. You are going to serve as a reservoir for the virus. So as soon as most of us are vaccinated, at least, a good number of us, I was saying 75% earlier, we will be able to go back to normal. And the estimate now is that in 6 months from now, given the fact that what we give 2 million doses per day, in 6 months from in August, we could really try to go back to normal. Now, there's a lot of incentive and efforts to go to 3 million doses per day, so that will reduce this lag period. And if there is no vaccine hesitancy, so if everyone, including the military, for example, that and members of our, in fact, community here are also refusing to get the vaccine, we need to really have the vaccine if we are offered the chance to have it, so that we can reach herd immunity as fast as possible.
But will life ever go back to normal?
I'm an optimist because I'm an immunologist, and my answer is that immune systems always win. So yes, I think we will go back to normal.
That's a great note to end on. Thank you so much, Dr. Merad. I think everybody learned a lot today, and I certainly did. And for me personally, it's also a thrill to be doing something for the 92nd Street Y. It's such an institution in New York City, and I'm really thrilled to have had this conversation with you.
Thank you, Apoorva. I also want to thank the 92Y for hosting the discussion today. And the 92Y has been enriching my family and friends for more than a decade. This is where my kids learn to swim. This is where they learn to play music. I regularly attend, in the pre-COVID era, the conferences and concerts organized by the Y. So I was very happy for the opportunity to be here today.